thing I want to do is make sure I have the right levels.
Sure.
And so, yeah, if you could sit right there,
Okay.
and then just tell me your name and the spelling of your name, please.
Sure. My name is David Sheen, and David is spelled D-A-V-I-D. Sheen is spelled S-H-E-E-N.
Very good. And how would I say what your title is?
Sure. You can say that I'm a journalist and a filmmaker living in Israel. Is that sufficient,
That's
or do you
very
like
good.
me to add more stuff to that?
That's just fine.
Okay.
And maybe I'll have you email me a bio later or something.
Not a problem.
All right, well, let's begin.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us why you are coming to USF Tampa tonight.
Mm-hmm. I'm coming to USF Tampa as part of a short tour of campuses in Florida and in North America. And I'm going to be speaking on this tour about Israeli incitement, specifically incitement by top political and religious figures in Israel, incitement to racism, incitement to violence. And it's based on my reporting, on the ground reporting in the last 5 years, and specifically that reached a zenith, really, the incitement this past summer during the assaults on Gaza. It was incredibly intense, and so there's a focus on what transpired this summer, but it also reflects on the last 5 years of my on-the-ground reporting there.
Give us an example of some of the incitement you're talking about. I imagine you have heard politicians say things that might cause people to be violent.
Mm-hmm. I mean, there's really so many examples, but just briefly, we're talking about people at the highest echelons of government, lawmakers, ministers, speakers of the parliament, and up to the prime minister, calling for vengeance, calling for killing, calling for ethnic cleansing, calling for genocide, calling to mutilate sexual organs of people deemed to be, enemies, calling for people to be sent to gas chambers. I mean, some of it's straight from the top, some of it's from, rabble, and of course in any society you have people who resort to the lowest level calls for violence. But really we have here documented again and again and again, people at the at the highest levels of power making these statements, some of them veiled, some of them using references to biblical, passages, and so you have to parse them, and you have to be familiar with some of the tropes and the references, but sometimes, very blatantly, without any filter through biblical language, just out and out saying, calling for extermination rather, and other such, atrocities. So it's pretty scandalous, especially because it would seem, although I'm not based here, it would seem that it's barely ever reported on in the North American media. It's disconcerting for people who live here and expect to have a well-rounded, picture of what's happening there. It would be fair to say you're not receiving one if you're not hearing about the level of incitement to racism that's going on in Israel today.
And one example that our listeners might be familiar about is a Tampa resident who happened to be on vacation in Palestine before the main war in Gaza started this summer, and his cousin had been killed, perhaps by moms that were incited by some of the speech you're
Most
talking about.
definitely.
What can you say about the violence that was inflicted upon Tariq Abu Qadir, the Tampa resident, and his cousin in
Muhammad. Yeah, certainly that event that transpired this summer was one of the most shocking and had the very far-reaching ramifications. I mean, first of all, let's talk about Muhammad Abu Qadir. It's fair to say that Netanyahu ordered the hit on him. I don't mind saying that because I think it's a valid statement to make. At a time when they discovered the bodies of these 3 Israeli teenagers that had been found, that had been murdered, when the country was baying for blood, and people were calling for so-called vengeance, meaning actually calls to inflict violence on Palestinian people, what did he do? Instead of calming tensions and calling for justice, which would have been a legitimate call, he called for vengeance. Okay, in other words, he triggered what we saw in the 24 hours that followed, in the 36 hours that followed, where a group of Jewish Israelis went, kidnapped, beat, and poured gasoline down the throat of Mohammed Abu Khder, and lit him on fire, burned him to death from the inside out. It was atrocious. And what you'll soon see for people who come tonight to my presentation is that in the days that followed, you had people, certainly people who were horrified by this and repulsed by it, but you also had people who cheered it on. Were like, yeah, great, that's awesome, we need more acts like that. And besides Netanyahu, you had many other top officials in the Israeli government and Israeli public figures who were calling for vengeance. And you had, just as one example, the head of the largest Jewish religious youth group in the world, B'nai Akiva, which is affiliated with one of the government factions. And the head of the Jewish youth group, he actually called for going out and not just killing 300 plus Palestinians, but scalping their penises and bringing back their foreskins as war trophies. You can't really get much sicker than that. I mean, that's pretty vile. And that person was never removed from his position. He holds that position to this day. He never had to apologize for his call to mutilate the sexual organs of Palestinians. That's just one example among many, sadly, and I'll detail many, 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 many more tonight. So I encourage people who are interested in this topic, whatever your political background, whatever your ethnic affiliation, to come out tonight to the school and to hear and listen to some of the evidence or some of the documentation that I will provide. And of course, I encourage people to follow up on that and do web searches afterwards to confirm the fact that I'm not making this stuff up, but it's all been reported on in at least the Israeli media, if not further. And again, I just want to say there's nothing really special about what I've done. I'm not a bad writer, I'm not a bad filmmaker, but I don't have any special talents. It's just that there's such a dearth of reporting on this racist incitement. Really, anyone who speaks Hebrew and English fluently could do it. Sadly, mainstream media is doing a disservice to its constituents and not reporting on stuff, which is frankly horrifying, and creating an environment where I live where racist mobs run through the streets of cities in Israel. And frankly, we're at the point where downtown Jerusalem has already been ethnically cleansed of Palestinians. You go on a Thursday night or a Sunday night to downtown Jerusalem, which is like the club night, the weekend, when people would be filling up the bars and such. And Jerusalem is a mixed city, so under normal healthy circumstances, you would have both Jewish Israelis and Palestinians at the same areas. And this has been the case for some time, but definitely it reached a peak during the summer and has maintained that peak since, where you have gangs roving through the streets, threatening and then assaulting Palestinian people, to the point where Palestinian people don't even come to downtown Jerusalem anymore. They're just afraid it's now being ethnically cleansed. So, and they're trying to clearly do this in other cities around the country too. It's not just a one-off. So that's the situation on the ground. I can state unequivocally, on a personal level, I refuse to continue living under such circumstances. It's completely reprehensible and unacceptable. The fact that many people consider that status quo to be acceptable and don't have a problem with it and don't report on it and don't protest against it is to me, astonishing. And frankly, I deserve more. My friends deserve more. Everyone living in the land deserves more. And if I can contribute to greater awareness of the problem and maybe in some small way contribute to a call for change and improvement in the situation, where we don't have to see racist mobs running through the street or any level of discrimination, but I mean, we're seriously seeing, a tipping point where it's just really over beyond the pale, to just put it mildly.
What do you think could happen in order to tip it toward less violence?
Well, I mean, first of all, people have to even know that it exists without even knowing that it exists, and for that to happen, we have to break through the curtain of the mainstream media. So alternative media is important, and social media is important. I think that there's certain leverage points that we have here. I think that here in Tampa, the fact that the Abu Khdar family, is rooted here, certainly, that Tampa residents have a special role to play because of the recent history. And I know also my understanding is that in Florida in general, perhaps Tampa specifically, but certainly in Florida, there a lot of Jewish communities down here, people who have family in Israel or who've spent time there in their lives, or who simply feel affiliated in the sense that the history of the country and the people speaks to them on a personal level. So I think people who are invested really should step up and take an active role, and maybe they're taking an active role in trying to quash these voices. But I think that there's a lot of potential there, because one thing I've noticed around the country is that there are a lot of youth who are clearly outraged and embarrassed about some of the things that I've described and others that I haven't, things that are taking place in Israel and things that are taking place in the West Bank and Gaza and are perpetrated by the Israeli government, the Israeli army. There's many Jewish youth who are ashamed of these acts, not to mean that they're culpable in them. That should never be the case. No civilian is responsible for the actions of their government, and definitely not for a government they're not even citizens of. But my point being that I think that a lot of Jewish people who are outraged by this could step up, could take a large role, and whether it's they have a role in protesting the complicity of their own community, so-called community organizations. So whether it's Jewish Federation or the other local organizations that claim to speak on behalf of the Jewish community or the organized Jewish community here, in recent months you had protests of these groups, maybe not here in Florida, but in other places like Boston and New York, DC. If I'm not mistaken, you've got groups who are coming out and saying, not in our name, and we unequivocally oppose these atrocities that are occurring, and we're calling for equality, or we're calling for an end to occupation, or whatever slogan they're using. But the general idea is this has gone way too far, and we have to, enough is enough, and we're going to take a public stand. So I think a lot of Jewish people, but again, it's really open to anyone. You don't have to be a blood Jew or a practicing Jew or any kind of Jew. You just have to be a human being and to be outraged by this level of hate, care enough about your fellow human beings to take a stand against it, do so. And the first step, like I said, is learning more about it. And you can do that tonight on campus when I speak to the groups, to Students for Justice in Palestine and others who will come to hear me.
If you have a couple more minutes, I want to ask you about going back to the Mohammed Abu Qadir, and then right before that, the 3 Israeli teens that were killed. Do you think that, I heard in the media, that in some media, that the Israeli government knew about what had happened to the teens before it was made public, and that was almost like a chance for the opinions and the blood to get boiling, and so that that might increase the chance that something would happen like what happened with Mohammed Abu Qadir, where there was violence, and that's something that the Israeli government did by keeping it under the information. Do you know anything about whether that was kept under?
Yeah, I can speak a little bit to it. I don't have any behind the scenes information, but just based on what's been reported openly in the Israeli media, even if we just focus on the Israeli actors. So there's 3 teenagers who were kidnapped. Each of them have families, parents who are grieving over the loss of their sons. The Israeli army and the Israeli security services should have informed them, like, look, it's likely that your kid's dead, but we're gonna try. There's a chance they're alive, but we're gonna try to find them, but it's not really looking good. But they did something very different. They said, oh, it's likely that your sons are alive. Now, they already had audio tapes where gunshots were heard, and no voices were heard afterwards. After here, so certainly it's possible that those were blanks. It's possible that those gunshots were not aimed at the boy. Like, there's all kinds of scenarios that conceivably could have meant that the three boys continued to live after those gunshots, but it's just less likely. So what would have been the responsible thing to do was just say, look, it's likely that they're dead, and not go on and start international campaigns where you send the mothers of these children to the United Nations to call for, please release our boys, who we are confident are alive, and blah. They created this whole international campaign, bring back our boys, it's playing off the Nigerian, bring back our girls, and it was complete, or almost complete, manipulation of the media, because they damn well knew that it was very likely that they were killed. That, to me, the fact that you would abuse the parents of these boys, Israeli Jewish boys, and let them go on television and talk about saving our sons when they knew that it was highly likely they were dead, is a way of abusing the families, using them and abusing them. And of course, it goes without saying that in the search for them, how many Palestinian families had their lives thrown upside down. They rampaged through the West Bank for weeks, taking money from people's houses and smashing stuff in their homes, when they damn well knew that it had nothing to do with the people whose lives they were ruining. It was just an excuse to run rampant through the West Bank and cause havoc. And this has been widely reported. I'm not introducing new information. So yeah, it's pretty disgusting. I don't have any more behind the scenes information, but it's unfortunate.
And finally, let me ask you about yourself. What's your background? Are you? I am learning that you're Jewish. You consider yourself Jewish. And what about the state of Israel? Do you think that there should be a Jewish democratic state, as they say, in where Israel is?
Interesting. Well, without getting into too much detail, yeah, I'm a blood Jew. I grew up in a Jewish family. I have Jewish parents. I grew up in a Jewish culture, Jewish camp, Jewish youth group, Jewish school, Jewish, Jew. And I'm also, I have papers. I have citizenship in Israel. My father also was born in Israel, and his family also. And so I have deep roots in the country, cousins, uncles, aunts. And I speak Hebrew fluently. And that's a bit of my backstory that explains my connection. I've spent about 10 or 12 years of my life in the country. And in terms of, you asked about my political vision for the land, I guess at this point, it seems to me that it's not possible for there to be both, pardon me for that knock, it's not possible for a country to be both a democracy and an ethnocracy, a country that gives levels of privilege to people of one specific ethnic group or ethno-religious group. Those are just incompatible with one another. So, given the choice between those two kinds of states, my preference is for there to be democracy, or one in which all people are equal and in which all people's rights are protected by virtue of them being human beings, not because they belong to one ethnic group or ethno-religious group or another. That's my personal vision. Of course, I'd like to see, as far as I'm concerned, anyone who wants to live in the country, ahlan wa sahlan, whether you're a Jewish person from any part of the world, whether you're a Palestinian refugee, whether you're African, Asian. I mean, to me, land doesn't belong to people. If anything, people belong to land. And there is, it's the very center of three continents. If anywhere is a place that's supposed to have open borders, it's that place. Allow people to make pilgrimages, stay a while, pass through, trade, flirt, make love, and do all the kinds of things that good multicultural societies do when they work. Unfortunately, Israel is very far from that. It's a society of multicultural Jews, but the racial composition or ethno-religious composition of the country is highly policed, and it's not healthy. for the society in all myriads of ways, some of which I've described. And so, yeah, I would like to see a different regime in which